The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that settled in your chest and made every breath feel like a heavy burden, the kind of atmosphere that made you question whether you should even be there. It was the night before a new chapter in scientific history would be written, and the world was about to discover something no one expected, a discovery that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the past, about death, and about the secrets buried deep within the earth. A team of leading archaeologists and scientists stood gathered in the dimly lit excavation site. Hidden beneath layers of dirt, stone, and centuries of history, an ancient coffin had just been unearthed. But this wasn't just any coffin. No, this was a relic of a long-forgotten civilization. The markings on the surface were unlike anything they had ever encountered. The wood aged but still intact, and the air around it seemed to hum with an energy that was almost unnatural. As the excavation team prepared to open the coffin, a decision was made. Something unexpected. Something that would forever change the course of this discovery. Rather than simply documenting the findings as they usually did, the scientists decided to install a hidden camera inside the coffin, something to capture the events as they unfolded, something that could provide answers to questions that had lingered for centuries. The camera would remain hidden within the ancient relic, recording every moment as the team carefully began to lift the lid. But no one could have predicted what would be caught on film. No one could have foreseen the chilling events that would unfold, events that would leave the team, and soon the entire world, in shock. And as the coffin lid creaked open for the first time in centuries, the team didn't realize that they were about to uncover a truth that would forever haunt them. A truth that would send shockwaves through the world of archaeology and beyond. It had been weeks of anticipation. The site was an excavation in the middle of a dense forest, located in a remote part of the world that had been largely untouched for millennia. Only a handful of archaeologists had even known about the site's existence, and it wasn't until recent months that they'd uncovered the evidence that led them here. And now, as the dawn light broke over the horizon, the final piece was about to be revealed. The coffin itself wasn't just any burial artifact. The team had discovered markings on the outside of the coffin that seemed to have symbolic meaning, symbols none of them had ever seen before. Ancient civilizations were known for their complex rituals surrounding death, and this coffin appeared to be no exception. The carvings on its surface hinted at something far older and far more mysterious than anything the team had encountered before. Dr. Lydia Blackwell, the lead archaeologist on the project, stood at the forefront of the team. Her years of expertise in ancient civilizations had earned her a reputation as one of the most respected figures in the field. And yet, as she stood before the coffin, there was something in her eyes, something more than just scientific curiosity. It was a sense of unease. Her colleague, Dr. Martin Hayes, who specialized in ancient artifacts, stood beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared the camera for its covert position. "Do you think it's safe?" he asked quietly. Lydia hesitated, glancing at the coffin one last time. "We don't know what's inside yet, Martin. But if there's even a chance this could lead to a groundbreaking discovery, we have to do everything we can to capture it." With a final nod, the camera was carefully placed in a small crevice inside the coffin, just out of sight. Then, the team began their work, slowly and methodically removing the heavy stone lid. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and the sound of the lid scraping against the stone echoed like a warning. And then, silence. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The team held their breath as they gazed inside the coffin, expecting to see a simple burial. But what they found was anything but ordinary. Inside the coffin lay not a body, but a perfectly preserved object wrapped in what appeared to be ancient linen. The object itself was small, no more than a foot long, and it shimmered faintly in the low light. A soft glow seemed to emanate from it, as if it were alive in some way. Dr. Hayes reached out slowly, his fingers trembling as they brushed the fabric. What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lydia crouched down next to him, her heart racing. She could hardly believe her eyes. The object was unlike anything she had seen before. There was an otherworldly quality to it, as though it had been untouched by time, preserved perfectly despite the centuries that had passed. "Whatever it is," Lydia said softly, "it's not something we were prepared for." As the team stood frozen, staring at the mysterious object, a quiet murmur of disbelief rippled through them. They had come expecting to find bones, perhaps the remains of an ancient ruler or an important figure. But this was something else entirely. Lydia's mind raced as she tried to piece together the significance of what they were witnessing. The markings on the coffin, the strange object inside, it all pointed to something much bigger than they could have ever imagined. But there was more. The camera, hidden within the coffin, had recorded the entire event, and as the scientists began to lift the object out of its resting place, the footage would soon reveal something so unsettling, so shocking, that it would change everything they thought they knew about the ancient world. As the team continued to examine the object, they failed to notice something small but ominous. The air around the coffin began to feel heavier, as though the very ground beneath their feet was shifting. At first, it was subtle, just a slight change in the temperature. But then, something more tangible, a faint, barely audible whispering. Lydia's eyes widened, and she turned to the others. "Did you hear that?" The team members exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Hayes, who had been closest to the coffin, stepped back as if a chill had suddenly washed over him. His breath was visible in the air, despite the warmth of the day. And then the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like words, though no one could quite make them out. The camera inside the coffin, still recording, captured it all. Suddenly, without warning, a loud crash erupted from somewhere deeper within the ruins. The team jumped, startled by the sound, and Lydia instinctively reached for the hidden camera to check its recording. What they saw would haunt them forever. On the footage, they saw it, the faintest movement, as though the object inside the coffin had shifted ever so slightly. Something was alive. Something was watching. The atmosphere in the excavation site grew heavier with each passing second. The once serene environment had shifted into something unnerving, as if the earth itself had become aware of the secrets being disturbed. The team, which had once been so certain of their scientific methods, now stood uncertain, hesitant, and plagued by a sense of dread they couldn't explain. Lydia, holding the camera in her hands, scanned the footage once again. The image of the object inside the coffin, now visibly shifting, sent a shiver down her spine. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The object had moved, not in the way a person might expect, but in a way that defied logic. The camera had captured something far more than just a simple burial. The movement, barely noticeable at first, now seemed to suggest something far darker, something alive. Is it possible that the object is reacting to the environment? Dr. Hayes asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His hand trembled as he reached out for the camera, which had been recording non-stop since the team first began their excavation. Lydia didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure what to say. The object had been buried for centuries, sealed away in the coffin, untouched and undisturbed. And yet, now, it seemed to stir, as though it were responding to the team's presence, or perhaps something far more sinister. What if it's something not human? Dr. Rebecca Klein, the team's expert in ancient texts, spoke up nervously. She had been silent for most of the day, focused on interpreting the symbols etched into the coffin, but now she couldn't help but voice the growing concern that was spreading among them. "No, Rebecca," Lydia responded quickly, trying to calm the rising tension. "We need to remain rational. This could be a result of the environment, perhaps the object reaction to changes in temperature or pressure." But deep down, Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers in the air, the sudden drop in temperature, and now the movement of the object, it was all too much to dismiss as coincidence. As the team continued to review the footage, something caught Lydia's eye. It wasn't the object's movement that disturbed her the most, but rather the strange energy that seemed to radiate from it. The camera had captured a series of flashes, tiny bursts of light that flickered just as the object shifted. These flashes, Lydia muttered, mostly to herself. "What are they?" Dr. Hayes, who had been staring at the footage alongside her, leaned in. "It looks like some sort of electrical discharge," he said slowly. "But it doesn't make sense. There's no way something like that could occur naturally inside a sealed coffin. Could it be some kind of advanced technology?" Dr. Klein asked. She sounded both intrigued and terrified, her voice trembling as she spoke. Lydia shook her head. "This isn't technology. It's something else. Something older. Something we don't understand." The team fell into a brief silence, each of them processing the implications of Lydia's words. They were all aware that they were standing on the brink of a monumental discovery, but none of them were prepared for what would come next. The air in the excavation site grew colder. The whispers, which had once been faint, now became clearer, echoing around them like a chorus of voices speaking in a language none of them recognized. The temperature dropped further still, and frost began to form on the stone walls of the chamber. It was as if the very presence of the coffin was warping reality itself. Lydia stood up abruptly. "We need to stop. We need to get out of here. Now." But before anyone could react, there was another movement. The object inside the coffin shifted again, but this time it wasn't just subtle, it was aggressive. The linen wrapping around it tore, revealing more of the object's true form. It was elongated, with jagged edges, as if it were made from material that defied natural laws. And as it was exposed to the air, the room seemed to darken, the shadows elongating unnaturally as if something malevolent was awakening. The team backed away in horror as the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The object began to pulse, emitting faint, rhythmic vibrations that seemed to resonate within their very bones. Lydia felt her pulse race, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. "We need to leave," Lydia repeated, her voice now more urgent. But just as she turned to head toward the exit, something halted her in her tracks. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall, shadowy, and completely out of place in the dimly lit ruins. It stood motionless for a moment, and then, slowly, it began to move toward them. The team froze. The air had become thick, stifling, as though the very atmosphere was closing in on them. Lydia's breath quickened as she watched the figure approach, its form indistinct and wavering, as though it were made of smoke or shadow. "Is that one of the locals?" Dr. Klein whispered, but no one answered. The figure moved closer, its presence chilling and alien. As it stepped into the faint light, the team could make out its features, or rather, the lack of features. It had no distinct face, no discernible body. It was as if the figure was a distortion of light and space, existing in a form that defied logic. Then it spoke. "Leave," it said, its voice a low, rasping sound that vibrated the walls. Lydia's heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't human. It sounded ancient, primal. The warning was clear. They needed to leave, and fast. Lydia was the first to break the spell, scrambling backward toward the exit. The team followed, fear now evident in every movement. But as they turned to leave, they noticed something strange. The coffin's lid, which they had carefully removed earlier, was now sealed again. The object inside had vanished, as if it had never been there. The team rushed out to the excavation site, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. Outside, the air was fresh and cool, but the sense of terror still gripped them tightly. They stumbled back to the camp, where they gathered around a fire, trying to make sense of the nightmare they had just witnessed. "What was that?" Dr. Hayes asked, his voice shaking. Lydia didn't have an answer. The figure, the object, the whispers, it all pointed to something far beyond their understanding. Whatever had been hidden inside that coffin was not just a relic from past. It was something alive, something powerful, and the camera, still recording, had captured it all. The team sat in silence, each of them haunted by the images they had seen. But Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Whatever they had uncovered, it was only the beginning. They had released something from its prison, and now it was awake. The night was far from over, but the team couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that gripped them. They sat around the campfire, their minds swirling with questions, none of which had answers. The figure in the doorway, the object that had vanished, and the eerie whispers, everything felt like a nightmare they couldn't wake from. Lydia Blackwell couldn't focus. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the figure's shadowy form and heard its rasping voice. The sense of something ancient, something not entirely human, seemed to linger in the air, thickening with each passing moment. She couldn't help but wonder, had they awakened something? Something that was never meant to be disturbed? Dr. Hayes and Dr. Klein sat across from her, their faces pale, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and fear. None of them had ever experienced anything like this. They had come to unearth history, to reveal the secrets of the past, but instead, they had stumbled upon a force that was beyond anything they could understand. I don't know how to explain it," Dr. Hayes muttered, his voice low and strained. The figure, the whispers, the object, it was all wrong. None of it made sense. Dr. Klein nodded, her hand shaking slightly as she took a sip from her cup. I've studied ancient cultures for years, but I've never encountered anything like this. It's as if we've uncovered a doorway, not just to the past, but to something much darker. Lydia ran her fingers through her hair, staring into the flickering flames. Whatever that thing was, it didn't just warn us to leave. It made it clear that we're not welcome here. We should have never gone inside that coffin. But as much as Lydia tried to convince herself that it was a mistake to continue, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of responsibility. The team had come this far, and they had a duty to understand what they had uncovered. They couldn't just walk away, not when they were so close. We need to go back, she said suddenly, her voice firm. The others looked at her in shock. What? Are you out of your mind? Dr. Hayes asked, his eyes wide. You saw what happened when we opened the coffin. It's not just an archaeological find. It's something much more dangerous. We can't go back there. Lydia's gaze hardened. We don't have a choice. We have to understand what we're dealing with. We need to find out what that object is, why it reacted the way it did, and why we saw that thing. We owe it to the world to uncover the truth. Dr. Klein hesitated. But Lydia, what if it's too dangerous? What if whatever is inside that coffin is not something we're meant to know? Lydia finished for her. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but we can't leave this unfinished. We need to go back. Despite the fear that gripped them, the team knew that Lydia was right. They couldn't just abandon the site now. But none of them were prepared for what they would encounter next. What they would find in that ancient coffin, and what it would mean for them all, was beyond anything they could ever imagine. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the ruins. The air was thick with mist, and the world felt strangely quiet as the team made their way back to the excavation site. They walked in silence, each of them bracing for what they would find. Lydia led the way, determination in her step despite the unease gnawing at her insides. Her mind raced with questions. What was the object? Why had it moved? What was the figure in the doorway? And most importantly, what had they disturbed? As they reached the site, the unease intensified. The coffin, still open, sat in the center of the chamber as it had before. But something was different this time. The air was colder than before, unnaturally cold, like a chill that settled in the bones. The whispers were back, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the stone walls. Lydia motioned for the team to be quiet. They moved cautiously toward the coffin, their eyes darting around as if expecting something to jump out from the shadows. As they approached the coffin, the strange object inside had not moved. It was still wrapped in the ancient linen, but now it radiated a dull, menacing glow, almost as though it was waiting. Lydia stepped closer to the coffin, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached for the object, but just as her fingers brushed against the linen, a sudden gust of wind howled through the chamber, blowing the flames of the nearby torches and extinguishing them in an instant. The temperature plummeted further, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It was then that Lydia noticed something horrifying. The shadowy figure, the one that had appeared the night before, was standing at the entrance again, its distorted form flickering in and out of existence. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, a second figure appeared, this one taller, more defined, its body shimmering with a faint light. It seemed to emanate power, a presence so overwhelming that it felt like the very ground beneath their feet trembled. Lydia took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. "It's happening again," Dr. Hayes whispered, his face pale with terror. Lydia's eyes were locked on the figures. She could feel their gaze, even though they had no eyes to speak of. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. But before they could move, the air grew thick with an unnatural pressure. The shadows in the room seemed to twist, coiling around them like a living entity. The whispers intensified, becoming almost deafening. Lydia's head spun, her vision blurring. She could feel the walls closing in around her, suffocating her. Then, as quickly as it began, it stopped, the air cleared, and the figures vanished, leaving nothing but the oppressive silence behind. The team was left standing in the darkened chamber, breathless, shaken, and terrified. We "We need to get out of here," Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper. But as they turned to leave, the camera they had placed inside the coffin, a camera that had been running the entire time, flashed once, then twice. The small screen on the device blinked with static, and the team watched in horror as the footage began to play out before them. On the screen, they saw the object, shimmering, pulsating, releasing a series of electric bursts, each one brighter than the last. The camera zoomed in, capturing every detail of the strange, otherworldly object. And then, just as the team was about to leave, the footage changed. The camera's lens cracked, and for one split second, the team saw something that would haunt them forever. The figures, had not disappeared. They were standing behind them, watching them through the lens. And then, the footage cut to black. The tension in the excavation site was unbearable. The camera, still flashing intermittently, now lay motionless in the dirt. The team stared at it in disbelief, their eyes wide, hearts racing with fear. They had come expecting answers, but instead, they had uncovered something far darker, something they were never meant to know. Lydia stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had felt the presence in the room, the oppressive weight that had filled the air. The figures, the whispers, it was all connected. Whatever had been hidden inside that coffin was no mere artifact. It was a force, ancient, powerful, and malevolent. "We have to destroy the camera," Dr. Hayes said, his voice shaking. "We can't let this thing see us. It's already too late, but we can't let it know we're still here." But Lydia shook her head, her eyes never leaving the camera. "It's too late for that. It knows. It's been watching us." The idea that some ancient force had been observing them this whole time, the thought was chilling. The camera had been their only connection to the mystery, their only way of documenting the discovery. But now, it felt like a portal, one that had opened to something far beyond their understanding. The figures had never left the site. They had been watching, and worse, they were aware of their presence. "We have to go," Dr. Klein urged, her voice cracking. "This is beyond us. We're in over our heads. We've unleashed something that we can't control." But Lydia stood still, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the sense that this was only the beginning. There was a part of her, a deep, primal part, that didn't want to leave. She needed to understand. She had to understand. Whatever was in that coffin had been sealed away for a reason. And now, they had disturbed it. "We need to find out what it is," Lydia said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her chest. "We can't walk away without answers." But as the team made their way toward the coffin, a horrifying realization struck Lydia. The shadows in the room, those eerie, flickering shapes, were moving again. Slowly, deliberately. It was as if the very walls of the chamber were alive, shifting, pulsating with an unseen energy. The air around them thickened, as though something was pushing against them from all directions. It wasn't just the figures that were watching. The very space itself was closing in, bending, warping. The coffin was no longer just a simple burial site. It had become a focal point for something far more sinister. "Get away from it!" Dr. Hayes shouted, grabbing Lydia's arm. But it was too late. Lydia's eyes locked onto the coffin. The object inside, the ancient relic, was pulsing once more, its energy radiating outward in waves. The linen surrounding it had fallen away, revealing its true form. It was not just an artifact, but something that defied all logic and reason. The object was alive, its surface shifting and changing like liquid metal, its shape constantly shifting. It was as though it were breathing. Lydia stepped forward, entranced by the strange energy emanating from the object. As she moved closer, the whispers returned. Louder this time, clearer. They were no longer just faint murmurs in the background. They were voices. They were calling to her. "Come closer." The voice was both alien and familiar, a guttural rasp that resonated in the pit of her stomach. It was the same voice she had heard before, the voice of the figure, the one that had warned them to leave. But now, it wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. Lydia's hand reached out, her fingers trembling as she hovered above the object. She felt a strange pull, an undeniable compulsion to touch it. The others shouted at her to stop, but she couldn't tear herself away. It was as though the object was calling to her, and deep down she felt a strange connection to it, one she couldn't explain, but one that she couldn't resist. "Lydia, don't!" Dr. Klein cried out. "You don't know what it is. Don't touch it." But it was too late. With a soft, almost imperceptible touch, Lydia's fingers brushed against the object. The moment she made contact, everything changed. A surge of energy blasted through Lydia's body, sending shockwaves through the air. She was thrown back, her body slamming into the stone floor. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, everything seemed to go dark. The voices, the whispers, grew louder, as if they were all around her. They weren't just in her ears now. They were inside her mind, inside her very soul. "You have awakened us." The words echoed in her head, each syllable vibrating through her bones. She could feel the presence of something ancient, something that had been buried for eons, stirring to life. It was as if the very ground beneath her feet was alive, breathing with the rhythm of an ancient heartbeat. Dr. Hayes and Dr. Klein rushed to her side, their hands trembling as they helped her sit up. "Lydia, are you okay?" Dr. Hayes asked, his voice panicked. But Lydia could hardly hear him. The voices were growing louder, and they were speaking to her, whispering secrets she couldn't comprehend. The coffin, the key, the end of the world. The words were fragmented, jumbled, but they carried a weight that crushed her chest. She could feel the energy inside the coffin swelling, pushing outward, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear apart. "Get away from it!" Lydia gasped, pushing herself up with difficulty. We've released something. We've opened the door." The team scrambled to their feet, their eyes wild with fear. But it was already too late. The coffin began to tremble, its contents shifting violently. The once dormant object inside began to glow with an unnatural intensity, and the room seemed to ripple with the energy that was being unleashed. The air around them crackled with static, and the temperature plummeted to freezing levels. It was as if a storm were gathering inside the chamber, one fueled by an ancient force. And then the ground beneath them began to crack. The team backed away as the walls of the chamber split open, and from the cracks, something began to emerge. Shadows twisted and writhed, taking shape, becoming more defined with each passing second. It was as though the coffin had opened a gateway, not just to the past, but to something far darker, something that had been sealed away for a reason. The shadows took form, slowly, deliberately. Figures, tall, skeletal, and twisted, emerged from the cracks in the stone. Their eyes were black voids, empty and endless, and their limbs were long and crooked, stretching unnaturally toward the team. Lydia felt her heart race. They were no longer just observing. They were coming for them. The shadows moved toward the team, their forms flickering in and out of existence. The whispers grew louder, and Lydia felt her body seize with fear. These were not just spirits. They were something more, a presence, an ancient force that had been waiting, patiently, for someone to unlock the door. The lead figure, the tallest, most terrifying of them all, stepped forward, its dark, hollow eyes locking onto Lydia's. It spoke again, its voice like the grinding of stones, the sound of 1,000 voices calling out in unison. "You have awakened us. You have set us free." And then, with one final, chilling whisper, it said the words that would haunt Lydia for the rest of her life. "Now, you will pay the price." The shadows that had emerged from the coffin closed in on the team, their forms shifting and distorting, like smoke caught in a powerful wind. The temperature had plunged to unbearable levels, frost forming on the stone walls, and the air had become so thick that it felt like they were breathing in the very essence of death itself. Lydia could feel her chest tightening as the cold gripped her, but it wasn't the cold alone that filled her with dread. It was a sheer weight of the presence, the oppressive, malevolent force that seemed to radiate from the figures. The tallest shadow, its hollow eyes fixed on Lydia, took another step forward. The ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet as the figure's movements distorted the space around it. It spoke again, its voice a guttural rasp that reverberated in their bones. "You should not have disturbed what was buried. You have broken the seal, and now there is no turning back." Lydia's heart raced as she stumbled back, her legs unsteady. She could feel the air around her vibrating with an otherworldly power. The figure's words echoed in her mind, but they didn't make sense. How could they have disturbed something so ancient? Something so powerful, and yet here it was, alive and angry, waiting for them to pay the price for their curiosity. "Stop, please!" Dr. Hayes cried out, his voice cracking with fear. "We didn't know. We didn't mean to." But the figure paid him no mind. It moved, its long limbs stretching impossibly far, and in an instant it was standing directly in front of Lydia. She froze, her mind racing. She could feel its coldness, the palpable void where her heart should have been. The figure reached toward her, its fingers like elongated claws. Suddenly, Lydia's thoughts snapped back to the footage they had captured, the camera inside the coffin. The energy it had been recording, the flashes of light, everything had been building toward this moment. This was no coincidence. They had awakened something far worse than a relic. It was an entity, an ancient, powerful being that had been sealed away for a reason. And now, it was free. The figure's fingers brushed against Lydia's face, and in that instant, a jolt of electricity shot through her, searing her skin. The pain was unbearable, but it wasn't just physical. It was mental, spiritual. She could feel her very essence being pulled away, like a part of her soul was being siphoned into the void. The figure was feeding on her fear, on her very life force. In the distance, the other shadows were moving closer, their forms solidifying as they approached, encircling the team. Their presence was suffocating, each one exuding an overwhelming sense of dread and death. Lydia's mind spun, her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she might lose consciousness. But then, amidst the chaos, a memory flickered in her mind, something she had overlooked in all their research. The ancient texts, the strange symbols they had found on the coffin, symbols that had been unintelligible at first. Lydia had spent hours translating them, but there was one word she hadn't fully understood, Zalgoroth. It was a key. It was the name of whatever ancient force had been sealed away. And now, it was awake. The figures, Zalgoroth, were not just spirits or monsters. They were something far worse. They were the remnants of a civilization that had long since vanished, beings who had transcended mortality and existed in a realm between life and death. The coffin wasn't a tomb, it was a prison. And now, that prison had been shattered. Lydia's eyes snapped open as the realization hit her. "We have to close it again. We have to put them back." "Zalgoroth," she whispered, barely able to speak through the suffocating fear. We didn't understand. You were never meant to be released." The figure in front of her seemed to pause, its hollow eyes narrowing as if it was studying her, listening to her words. It cocked its head, as though curious. The others around her remained silent, watching, their bodies frozen in fear. "You speak the name," the figure rasped, its voice echoing in her mind. "But it is too late. The seal is broken, and you are bound to the consequences of your actions. You shall never leave this place. You shall never know peace." Lydia's mind raced, trying to grasp any shred of hope. There had to be a way to stop this. There had to be something they could do to reverse the damage they had caused. She glanced around at her team, their faces pale with terror, and she knew that they had to act. They couldn't let these creatures return to the world. "The coffin," Lydia said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "The key is in the coffin. If we can seal it, if we can put the object back, maybe we can undo what we've done." Dr. Klein, whose face had been drained of color, looked at Lydia with a mix of fear and determination. "You're suggesting we open it again? After everything we've seen? No, that's suicide." But Lydia's mind was made up. If we don't, these creatures, will keep coming. They won't stop. They'll destroy everything. She turned toward the coffin, her body shaking, but there was no turning back now. She had felt the presence of Zalgoroth before, its cold touch, its insidious power, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before the shadow figures consumed them all. With a deep breath, Lydia stepped toward the coffin, her hands trembling as she reached for the ancient relic. The moment she touched it, a surge of energy shot through her, sending her reeling backward. The ground beneath her cracked and split as the shadows rushed toward her, but Lydia fought through the pain, forcing herself to stand. "Zalgoroth," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. We'll seal you away again. You were never meant to be free." As she spoke, the ground trembled violently, and the shadows seemed to hesitate, as if considering her words. The air crackled with energy, and Lydia could feel the struggle within the very fabric of reality itself. The object inside the coffin pulsed with power, and the temperature plummeted even further. She could see the figures drawing nearer, their forms now solidifying into more than just shadows. They were becoming real, tangible threats. But Lydia held her ground. The others stood behind her, their fear palpable, but there was something else too, a sense of resolve. They had come here to uncover the truth, but now they had to end it before it consumed them all. With one last surge of strength, Lydia reached out and touched the object once more. As her fingers made contact, a blinding flash of light filled the chamber, and the shadows screamed, loud, high-pitched cries of rage and desperation. The very walls of the chamber seemed to convulse, and for a moment, Lydia feared it might all collapse around them. Then, with a deafening roar, the chamber fell silent. When Lydia opened her eyes, the shadows were gone. The figures, the oppressive energy, everything had vanished. The air was still, and the temperature had returned to normal. The coffin, however, remained open, the object inside still glowing faintly. The team stood in stunned silence, unsure of what had just happened. Lydia's body was still trembling, but she felt a strange sense of relief. The force that had been unleashed had been contained, at least for now. She glanced at her team, each of them wide-eyed and silent, but they were alive. We did it, Dr. Klein said, her voice barely a whisper. Lydia didn't reply at first. Her gaze lingered on the coffin, on the object that had caused so much destruction. It wasn't over. Not completely. We need to leave, Lydia said finally. We've done what we can, but we can't stay here. We can't risk disturbing it again. As they turned to leave the excavation site, Lydia felt the weight of what they had uncovered, of the force they had unleashed. The truth was far darker than they had ever imagined. They had come in search of history, but what they had found was far beyond human comprehension. And the truth was that some things, no matter how tempting, were never meant to be discovered.